All right. Welcome to all of you to the Institute on Religion and Democracy. And this evening devoted to conversation about Christian realism, specifically pivoting off an important book published just last year, The Future of Christian Realism, whose two co-editors are here with us this evening, Dallas Gingles from Southern Methodist University and Joshua Mauldin for the Center for Theological Inquiry at Princeton, New Jersey. They will speak to us for 15 minutes each, and then at 7 p.m. sharp, our two respondents will begin. They are Marc LiVecche, our in-house resident scholar here, resident Just War scholar, and his former classmate and colleague, Debra Erickson, who is a political theorist and sometimes contributor to Providence magazine, our Christian realism journal here at the IRD. So the formal talks will conclude no later than 7:20, as Marc and Debra will each speak 10 minutes. And then there'll be time for questions and comments, and we'll aim to conclude by 8 p.m. So thanks so much to all of you who are here, especially to those of you who are speaking to us, starting with, alphabetically, I suppose we'll start with Dallas Gingles, if that's all right.
Thank you very much.
What, this is a reference? Or
no, I'm good. Thank you. Appreciate it. Yeah. I want to begin by saying thanks to Marc and to IRD for hosting this event, for the very kind hospitality, and to all of you who are joining us here in person or online. I'm going to read my paper, which is not exactly representative of the book itself, but is sort of, I think that you'll see in both the introduction and the conclusion, the connection that I'm drawing to it. I can't recall who said it, but I remember, and maybe it was actually somebody in this room, I don't know, but I remember hearing someone describe Christian realism as the only theological project native to the United States. There is some overlap with Stanley Hauerwas's criticism that the topic of Christian ethics in America is America. Hauerwas is almost certainly correct in this criticism, and if you doubt him, I invite you to attend the AAR and or the SCE this year in the wake of the election. It is shocking how many people who spend their entire lives denouncing America as intrinsically vicious for the better part of 400 years act as if paradise was lost 9 days ago. Taken together, Hauerwas's criticism and the observation about the American natality of Christian realism suggests that any attempt to rehabilitate the civic life of America is almost inevitably going to be a process of recovering the Christian realist tradition, though I'm entirely confident that this was not a task Hauerwas meant to commend. In a paper of this length, I cannot recover an entire tradition, and I certainly can't rehabilitate the civic life of America. What I hope to do is show how Christian realism, formulated in its paradigmatic form by Reinhold Niebuhr, is a recognizably American form of political theology. Niebuhr's dialectic of transcendence and finitude, with the concomitant temptations to pride and sloth, give theoretical heft and conceptual nuance to a set of theological assumptions that have constituted America's understanding of itself since its inception. The tradition of American political theology that I'm tracing is one that poses the country as a theological question to itself. And here I'm borrowing from St. Augustine's lovely line in the Confessions that he has become a question to himself. In summary form, the question is, what is the country's relationship to God? Originally posed by a set of dissident Protestants with a commitment to religious liberty, at its inception, that is, this question is uniquely American. The kind of theological project America is or would be has always been underdetermined and intentionally ambiguous. This is ironically because it is in part due to the fact that the United States is the first or one of the first countries in which Protestantism is native. We did not have a Reformation. The deep Protestant convictions of the earliest theorists of America help account for the fact that the nation is inescapably a theological one, but its theological shape is underdetermined. Now, a perfectly obvious answer to the question about the country's relationship to God is there isn't one. This is the answer you would expect from an atheist, but also an answer that you could give from the context of a political theory like the social contract tradition, saying something like, because authority is strictly from the consent of the governed, the authority of God is ruled out. What's interesting is that this is not the answer that any president has ever given. Instead, presidents have willingly taken up the challenge posed by the country asking about its relationship to God by offering various interpretations, from early Puritan inflected appeals to covenant to more recent evangelical inflected appeals to 2 Chronicles 7:14, in which the nation as a whole needs a kind of individual salvation. But the paradigm in this form of speech is Abraham Lincoln, who inherits a tradition leading up to the Civil War, crystallizes it, and bequeaths it to those who come after him. My interpretation here draws on the work of Mark Noll, who describes the dominant form of thought from the country's inception to the antebellum period as a synthesis of evangelicalism, common sense Enlightenment philosophy, and republicanism, including an emphasis on republican virtues. And there's an important subset of questions about the relationship between the political theological tradition and the cultivation of republican or civic virtue. And my argument has something to do with that implicitly, because I see the public rhetoric of presidents reflecting the theological life of the country and helping provide a framework for the cultivation of those virtues. But I don't have time to address it here explicitly. But just one brief word on it. We were talking about this a bit before the session began. I am deeply skeptical about the ongoing existence of the theological tradition that I'm tracing, given the complete absence of it in the rhetoric of Donald Trump and Kamala Harris. J.D. Vance is deeply theological, and it may be that his theological vision of the country is the main one on offer for the next 4 years, though I have no confidence that Donald Trump will allow space for another person to have the platform necessary to think about the country, posing it as a question to itself. Even if he is given that platform, his vision is much more Roman Catholic than the deeply Protestant one that has shaped American self-reflection to this point. And I wonder if his vision would be recognizable to the country and provide the framework for the cultivation of civic virtue that it normally provides. So that's my own, I'll conclude with that parenthetical thing. Drawing from Noll's synthesis, along with his account of the way the doctrine of providence functioned in the Civil War era, I want to argue that Lincoln inherits, transforms, and then bequeaths to the country an account of political theology that emphasizes in equal measure moral aspiration and human brokenness. Both humans as such and the country in this tradition are constituted this way. And in some way, this is true of the country because of its relationship to God. It has a kind of divine task in history. But because that task is shaped at least as much by its relationship to history as it is by its relationship to the divine, it inevitably fails. Its calling is in excess of its possibilities. The most important theorist of this tradition, I think, is Reinhold Niebuhr, whose Christian realism located what he called responsible human action between the temptations of pride on the one hand and sloth or sensuality on the other. The first overestimates the possibilities of human action to achieve what only God can, perfect justice. The other, on the second, uses the recognition of the limitations of human action as an excuse to abdicate responsibility for attempting to pursue justice at all. Niebuhr's account of responsibility emerges in his work at approximately the same time that America emerges from the comfort of isolation to the discomfort of dominance on the world stage. The dialectic that explains responsible human action also explains the action of countries, all of which are prone to overestimate their moral purity and or to shirk the burdens that history or providence or God has given them to bear. Niebuhr develops this position in some detail in his 1952 book, The Irony of American History, where he interprets the country's self-understanding as a kind of naivete, and its assumption that its history of global isolation has made it morally superior to its European forebears and thus that it is prone to either overestimate its abilities to transform the world or to extend the pretense of innocency by retreating from the global challenges posed most clearly by the Soviet Union's expansionism. The depth of Niebuhr's appreciation of Lincoln is evident in the fact that he chose to close irony with an analysis of Lincoln's second inaugural. This is how Andrew Finstuen describes Niebuhr's account of Lincoln. Niebuhr's appreciation of James Madison was second only to his appreciation of Lincoln. Madison diagnosed history. Lincoln, for Niebuhr, modeled a Christian politics that could save it. Niebuhr regularly invoked Lincoln's second inaugural address as the archetype of a Christian politics. It's no wonder that Niebuhr understood Lincoln as this sort of paradigm. Lincoln's second inaugural is widely considered the greatest text in this tradition, not just the greatest by a president, but the greatest even as a theologian. In that speech, Lincoln meditates on the causes of the war, refusing to explain the activity of God in it, but equally firm that it is somehow within the workings of providence. And all of this to an audience of young men, most of whom were missing limbs, widows, and orphans, all of which was occasioned by the war. Part of Lincoln's careful refusal to attribute the war or any of its particular elements to God is that he refuses to attribute them directly to any agent. In fact, he goes to great rhetorical lengths to describe the unity of the pre-war actors in their desire to avoid war, where he says, all dreaded it, all sought to avert it. He continues with that repetition of all for several sentences. Both parties deprecated war, but one of them would make war rather than let the nation survive, and the other would accept war rather than let it perish. And the war came. And the war came. Lincoln is intentionally ambiguous. Who started the war? I'm teaching a course right now on presidential rhetoric and American political theology, in which I'm doing some of the same stuff. And when I ask this question, who started the war, to my students, about this size crowd or classroom, on this side of the room, somebody yelled, the South. And on this side of the room, somebody yelled, the North, and paused for a beat. And somebody said, God. All of which are very live options in Lincoln's second inaugural, and as is Lincoln himself being the one who is responsible for the war. And it's in this context that Lincoln locates the more transcendent, he's less ambiguous about the cause of the war, which he says is the preservation of the Union. And it is only within this context that Lincoln locates the more transcendent moral cause of emancipation, a cause necessitated because of the localized injustice of slavery in the South. But this is where you get the famous lines about both men read the same Bible, pray to the same God, all of this sort of stuff. The prayers of both could not be answered. That of neither has been answered fully. The Almighty has his own purposes. Woe unto the world because of offenses, for it must needs be that offenses come, but woe to that man by whom the offense cometh. If we shall suppose that American slavery is one of those offenses which in the providence of God must needs come, but which having continued through his appointed time, he now wills to remove, and that he gives to both North and South this terrible war, as the woe due to those by whom the offense came, shall we discern therein any departure from those divine attributes? Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray, etc. With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right. Let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. Somewhere else, Lincoln wrote, moral cowardice is something which I think I never had. And I think that this is surely true given this speech. Can you imagine saying these things to an audience who had borne the weight of the horrors of war for years? Lincoln knew at that point that victory was in sight. Atlanta had recently been taken. He could have claimed vindication for his position and offered his listeners the comfort of moral self-justification. Instead, he located their work, bearing the burdens of war, in the destiny of the country as a whole. Him who shall have borne the battle, and his widow and his orphan, applies equally to North and South. That way of describing the country before God may be less satisfactory than the warm blankets of easy justification. But Lincoln's moral courage is what undergirds his willingness to undertake the most weighty of acts without claiming ultimate justification for them. This is the tradition that Niebuhr developed for his contemporary audience, in which the nation would have to risk its innocency without succumbing to the temptation to overestimate its abilities to remake the world in its image. That the nation, no less than an individual, should cultivate and exercise the virtue of responsibility. At this point in our history, it isn't clear to me that we have the capacity to even identify an interpretation of our shared life that revolves around the cultivation of responsibility in this vein, of a life of civic moral aspiration that is as evident in a sense of its ambiguity or even guilt about failure to achieve its aspirations as it is in a sense of victory in our progress toward them. We can lose the country by denying that it is in any sense a theological project, and we can lose it by claiming to fully comprehend and thus bring about the completion of that project. The future of the country may then depend in some way upon a future for Christian realism as the theological account of the country that begins by rejecting those easy answers and then exercising just enough courage to pursue the right as God gives us to see it. Thank you.
At a time when democracy is under threat from external adversaries and internal decay, I think there's much to gain from revisiting Reinhold Niebuhr's defense of democracy, which is most explicitly articulated in his book, The Children of Light and the Children of Darkness. Especially pertinent for the contemporary moment is the way Niebuhr juxtaposes in that book a justification for democracy with a trenchant analysis of why the democratic children of light are prone not only to overestimating their own virtue, but also paradoxically to underestimating the external threats posed by what he thinks of as the autocratic children of darkness. Published in 1944, The Children of Light, it marks Niebuhr's turn toward a modest defense or a moderate defense of democracy and away from the Marxist-inflected catastrophism of Moral Man and Immoral Society and its follow-up book, Reflections on the End of an Era. The publication of Children of Light followed on the heels of the international acclaim Niebuhr received for his 2-volume magnum opus, Nature and Destiny of Man, based on his 1939 Gifford Lectures. While theological claims are rather sparse in Children of Light, the theology of nature and destiny is the unstated background of the political philosophy that the book defends. Written at the height of Niebuhr's powers, Children of Light is among the clearest and most concise of his writings. As the subtitle of this book, Children of Light, indicates, the book is a vindication of democracy and a critique of its traditional defense. What did Niebuhr take to be that traditional defense? This is an account that remains, I think, surprisingly prevalent up to the present day. Put simply, I see it as a moral defense. The traditional account is a moral defense of democracy as opposed to a political defense, we might say. A moral defense centers on a claim such as democracy is required because human beings have a right to determine the nature of their government. Niebuhr's view is less aspirational. It's based on a clear-eyed, realist understanding of human nature and thus of a form of government that's appropriate to that nature. That nature, as Niebuhr had previously elaborated in Nature and Destiny, is marked by the finitude, that is the natural limitation of all creatures, as well as by our human capacity for transcendence. Sin is the inevitable, if not necessary, result of this dual nature, as anxiety about our finitude leads us in our pride to imagine ways to overcome it. Herein lies the root, Niebuhr suggests, of all social conflict and violence, and on this basis, an entire political philosophy can be constructed. Thomas Hobbes rightly insisted that all societies require some minimal level of order. Without a stable order, enforced by coercion, people will take advantage of one another. The strong will prey on the weak, and chaos will ensue. So one strand of Western political thought acknowledges this reality and concludes that the only response is a strong state to act as a bulwark against the sinful nature of humanity. The picture of the government as the sword, as we find it in Luther's thought, is one that Hobbes develops into a full-fledged political philosophy. Now, Niebuhr agrees with the importance of the sword, as you see it in Luther, but with the important qualification that this vision fails to acknowledge the evil tendency of the ruler. Sin creates the need for a strong government, but how can we protect ourselves from the sin of those who rule over us? As Niebuhr himself writes, quote, "The first task of a community is to subdue chaos and create order. But the second task is equally important and must be implicated in the first. That task is to prevent the power by which initial unity is achieved from becoming tyrannical," end quote. It would be nice if those who rule over us were consistently virtuous and wise. But the fact that that is now almost a laugh line suggests otherwise. In a democratic structure, however, with checks and balances and rule of law, those who govern are held accountable to the people, and thus their power is held in check by the very people they're called to serve. Democracy, Niebuhr suggests, is thus validated not because people deserve it, but rather because it represents the best way to maintain a stable government without sliding into tyranny. And as Niebuhr famously puts the point, man's capacity for justice makes democracy possible, but man's inclination to injustice makes it necessary. Now, as I said at the beginning, alongside this defense of democracy in this book, we find an analysis of global politics as a perpetual struggle between the children of light and the children of darkness. The children of light are characterized by what Niebuhr calls stupidity, while the children of darkness are characterized by cynicism. The children of light fail to recognize the self-interest that's present in all human activity, including their own, while the children of darkness recognize the reality of self-interest, but fail to acknowledge any higher law beyond that. So both the children of light and the children of darkness fail to fully account for the reality of human nature, which is characterized both by a finitude, which makes self-interest unavoidable on the one hand, as well as this capacity for self-transcendence, which allows us to imagine ever wider circles of concern that transcend the self. The optimistic framework of modern culture assumed that all social strife was grounded in a basic survival impulse. Now, Niebuhr contends that this survival impulse in human beings is spiritualized, branching out into the opposing interests of a will to power on the one hand and a natural impulse towards self-giving on the other. The optimism of modern culture led the children of light to believe that if only we met everyone's basic survival needs, and you still see this in a lot of political debate today, if only we met everyone's basic survival needs, all social strife would disappear. The children of darkness are aware that this is false because human society is characterized by a kind of politics of recognition. What does that mean? Human life is determined not only by the desire to survive physically, but also by other goals that are more zero-sum in nature and not easily harmonized. things like prestige, honor, power. We can't all have them in equal measure. The children of darkness emphasize the will to power, but fail to recognize the other aspect of human nature, which Niebuhr summarizes under the biblical adage, "He that findeth his life shall lose it, and he that loseth it for my sake shall find it." The children of light, on Niebuhr's view, seek a laudable goal. They at least believe themselves to be acting for the good of the whole. Their error is one of self-deception. They're unaware of the extent to which their own actions are intermingled inevitably with self-interest. Thus, for Niebuhr, the behavior of the children of light is ironic. They do not understand what they do, while the children of darkness are not so self-deceived. They recognize their own interest as their only end, and they seek it alone. The question remains today, who are more dangerous? Those who believe with certainty that they are acting in the service of ideals, or those who acknowledge that they act purely in terms of self-interest? Now, we might be inclined to prefer the former. That's the children of light, who at least intend in some part of their psyche to pursue the good. But a quick perusal of the history books, as you all know, reveals many cases in which those who believe themselves to be pursuing the good end up causing horrendous suffering. And as Niebuhr himself observed, quote, "Some of the greatest perils to democracy arise from the fanaticism of moral idealists who are not conscious of the corruption of self-interest in their own proposed ideals." End quote. All that said, Niebuhr does not advise us to give up our moral ideals and throw in our lot with the children of darkness. Instead, we are to undertake a kind of delicate balancing act, maintaining awareness of self-interest alongside recognition of our capacity to transcend self-interest. We must remain aware of the reality of self-interest, that is, without giving self-interest moral justification. So we seek to transcend self-interest in order to attain moral ends, believing this to be possible, but not thinking it easy, lest we be characterized by the stupidity that's the temptation of the children of light. It's a challenging task, and the danger of self-deception is ever present. In this last section, I want to turn and take all this background thinking and think a bit about the contemporary global political situation. Niebuhr saw America as paradigmatic of the children of light, pursuing what it saw as the highest good on the world stage, while largely unaware of the self-interest and self-deception that characterized its own activity. Niebuhr tended to see communism, including in its Soviet form, as another version of the children of light. While Stalinism in this time was beginning to look to many like the children of darkness, Niebuhr was focused on the way in which Soviet communism exemplified the tendency of the children of light to commit evils in the service of utopian ideals. By contrast to both the US and the Soviet Union, National Socialism in Germany was the paradigmatic example of the children of darkness, because it was a political movement that sought no higher end than the self-interest of its own people. What I want to say for today is I think today's children of light are strangely more pessimistic than the optimistic children of light in Niebuhr's own day, while nonetheless managing to overestimate their own virtue. The children of light today fail to reckon with the vulnerability of democracy in the face of rising authoritarian powers abroad, who have risen by exploiting globalized systems of trade that the children of light had assumed would mark the end of history and the final victory of democracy. Alongside these external threats, there has emerged a kind of internal political decay, whereby the democratic children of light have lost confidence in the moral legitimacy of democracy itself. Unable to defend democracy against its rivals, the democratic children of light, allow the illiberal children of darkness to foment discord within democratic nations while increasing their own share of power on the global stage. The result is democracy is left vulnerable to dire threats from within and without. Niebuhr criticized American politics and foreign policy for oscillating between what he called moods of complete irresponsibility and moods of cynicism. In the one mood, he said, it would disavow the responsibilities of power because it fears its corruptions. In the other mood, it displays an adolescent pride of power and a cynical disregard of its responsibilities. And as he would say, quote, clearly it's become necessary for the children of light to borrow some of the wisdom of the children of darkness, and yet be careful not to borrow too much, end quote. Today, we find both left-wing and right-wing criticisms of the United States as the children of light. The left highlights the way in which America has pretended to serve a higher good in the international sphere, while in fact often serving itself. On this view, a retreat from the world stage is meant to extricate us from morally fraught situations, removing the temptation to serve ourselves under the guise of a kind of international police force. The right-wing retreat has a different motivation, even if the result is pretty similar. On this view, the United States should no longer intervene for the good of the whole, but only when its own interests are very clearly at stake. Donald Trump's opponents have howled at this blatant attempt to give up on pursuit of a higher good, even as many of these same critics have long suggested that any action America took on the international stage would inevitably be nothing more than an imperialistic power grab. How we Americans conceive of ourselves as a nation bears momentous implications for our foreign policy and thus for the future of international relations as a whole. I think there's still space for the United States to lead, but there are obvious countervailing forces in this country and abroad that push against that. But we should not make no mistake, that a non-American-led world will not be a Swedish-led world. We no longer live in the days of the 90s when globalization promised to break down national borders and people believed the entire world would soon be like one big Belgium. The authoritarian powers are on the rise. Americans might be tired of leading, and the rest of the world, including in places like Europe, might not be so sure they still want us to. But if we don't, who will? Thank you.
I am one of two people that has been tasked with a response to these two papers, but I'm going to say that I did not see the papers in advance, so I had some indication of what they would say, but not the full thing. So I hope to hit some of the themes that Dallas and Josh have so capably introduced, but also as a respondent, I'm going to try to tee up some points for discussion later that we'll have after Marc and I have both spoken. So I'm going to start by saying I have three. My comments fall under three headings. What I'll call first the theoretical, secondly the contextual, and thirdly the practical. And since our theme for tonight is the future of Christian realism or the future for Christian realism, my comments are aimed towards where we might be going, both as thinkers and in how Christian realism reflects upon and perhaps informs policy decisions. Dallas gave us an account of Christian realism as a political theology, or maybe a theological project, America as a kind of theological project, with Abraham Lincoln and Reinhold Niebuhr as paradigmatic cases of that theological project or political theology. And then we heard from Joshua, and he gave us the contours of Niebuhr and focusing on the paradox and irony that are really hallmarks of Niebuhrian realism that are at the heart of it. And I appreciated bringing it at the end to using one example of current discussions over America's role in the world, or generally what's going on in international relations. So I'm going to start with talking a little bit about theoretical. What you can see in my brief characterizations of their papers is that Christian realism actually comes in a number of flavors. And Niebuhr in particular, there's actually multiple strands of Niebuhrian realism. He's claimed by both liberals and conservatives, largely because he was actually on both sides of several issues. He himself was at times, many people may know he started life sort of as a committed Marxist and then kind of became neoconservative in his later years. So when we say Christian realism, it's not just one thing. And I think there's a pretty specific reason why that is, that there isn't just one thing like Calvinism that we might talk about, and that's because I don't see Christian realism as a political theology or a civil religion, and I also don't think it's an ethic. I wouldn't even call it an ethic, in the sense that I wouldn't look to Christian realism to help me determine right from wrong. I would call it a political theory. It's a way of approaching politics as an account of what politics is and what politics is about. And I see myself, if I was going to label myself, I would call myself an Augustinian realist rather than a Niebuhrian specifically. And as features of that, I would say, and here are some things we can discuss. Politics is necessary, and it can be a source of human goods and virtues. And I'm not sure that all Christian realists might say that. Secondly, it's always proximate due to human fallibility and sin, as Joshua said to us in his account of Niebuhr. My view of Christian realism is that Christian realism is Augustinian specifically because it analyzes politics based on an account of human beings, not just as sinful, because that we share that in common with many other Christian thinkers or Christian streams of thought, but it's based on an account of human beings as desiring creatures. You can desire the good of others through politics, is how you would act that out. Or you can desire to dominate others, and also use politics as a means to work that out. So I see Christian realism then as an orientation to politics, not an ethic. And it steers between, a nihilistic or cynical realism on one side that divorces politics from ethical considerations, and a utopianism on the other side based on a view of humanity as basically good. So there, I think I agree with Joshua. And in the book that I think we were all referring to, that's the title, was the inspiration for tonight. I feel like there are hints in the book and in Christian realism more generally that politics is fundamentally tragic. And so a question I would pose is that really the case? And if so, what is the future if it's fundamentally tragic? So that's the theoretical comments. My second set of comments or reflections is about the context or the contextual nature, the context of the future of Christian realism. So if we take Niebuhr as our exemplar, things are strikingly different now, I would say, than when he was in the height of his writing, which started about 100 years ago, not quite, and sort of continued till about the early 1960s. I think one of our biggest dividers now, and most of you I think would probably agree, is not between rival ideologies. It's not fascism, communism, capitalism, but rather partisan polarization, at least in the United States. If there is an ideology that's really inflecting how people view politics and evaluate it morally, it's probably the anti-colonial, anti-racist lens. That kind of ideological approach to politics still seems alive and well. And you can see it particularly in some of the responses to the war in Israel, Gaza. The framing of it as Israel is a settler colonial power, and therefore they are morally wrong and Hamas is morally right. Whereas you would probably from like a just war perspective, which is closer to the Christian realist perspective, you would say that at least in terms of the cause of war, Israel was the injured party and Hamas was the aggressor. And I talk about partisanship because it's become so extreme, even in my lifetime, that the most banal issues can become politicized. So like, whatever the issue is, red is on one side, blue is on the other side. Things that didn't used to be partisan now are just neatly divided. If you like this, I like that. And that, I think, is a significant change from what was going on in Niebuhr's time, and also just makes it very difficult to have conversations across difference. I think we're also moving into a post-truth era of politics as entertainment, and the fact that so much political discussion is about how entertaining it is a real problem for people who want to cut through the noise and make arguments for things they think will serve the good of the country or their neighbor or other nations. And here my lodestar is the book Amusing Ourselves to Death by Neil Postman, which, interestingly, if you've read the book recently, you'll know that Donald Trump makes an appearance as a case study in the things that he's talking about, and how prescient that now appears. So in this climate, a Niebuhrian skepticism of power in all its forms, or especially the seduction that power provides when you have gotten it. And that, I think, is something that Joshua had referred to early in his talk. That the sword is there to subdue disorder and then prevent power from becoming tyrannical. I think that skepticism can easily degenerate into both sidism or whataboutism. And political debate is made much more difficult by bad faith arguments from either side, although currently I think they're largely from one side, as well as avoiding inconvenient truths because they might give ammunition to the other side. So in this context of polarization, you have a lot of bad faith arguments, you have a lot of whataboutism, and you have a lot of people saying, well, we can't revise our position because the other side might use it against us. All of that is very corrosive to both any attempt at realism and also any attempt at democratic debate. And after all, I see democracy as a way of trying to resolve political differences without violence. So that's the context, where I see our context is different from Niebuhr, and what does that mean what does that say about the possibilities for Christian realism into the future? And finally, practical. And here a question is, and I borrowed this, I read this, and I read it, and unfortunately I cannot remember who said it. But one of the questions would be what makes Christian realism different from what else is on offer? For instance, someone was like, well, if you're like a never-Trumper, then how is being a Christian any different than what the Bulwark is doing, for instance? Anyway, apologies to whoever wrote that I can't remember right off the top of my head. But what I want to know is, does Christian realism, I mean, it needs to, right? Or it's not worth pursuing, but does it illuminate problems more than any other generic approach to politics? I also think another current practical issue that's a problem for Christian realist thinkers is the issue of abortion. And I say this, it's a practical matter, as in how do we apply this? Because for so many Christians who might otherwise be attracted to Christian realism, abortion is the one issue on which they will not take a nuanced position. It is an absolutist position. And that then becomes a sticking point for how they're willing to think about the rest of politics and how they act in the political sphere. So Christian realism's influence practically will be limited if on that issue people are not willing to take a somewhat more realistic and perhaps even tragic approach. Third, I think Christian realists need to pay closer attention to economics. 2 reasons. One, it's pretty clear people care about that. 2, Niebuhr cared a lot about economics. That was kind of how he got his start in politics as a pastor who was concerned about the workers in his congregation. And also because many political issues are actually have economic elements or even economic at their root. Immigration, globalization, housing, even gender politics all have economic dimensions. And I would like to see more of that. Now, I studied with Gene Elshtain, as did Marc. And one thing that struck me when we were working on the book was that very few people who contributed to that book had much to say at all about economics. And even Elshtain herself didn't write on it very much. And it struck me that was a significant lacuna. And so finally, I guess I would like to say, and this will be for Dallas and Joshua, who worked on the book, to say is, borrowed from Eric Patterson, do you see a future research program for Christian realists? Like, what are the key questions we want to be attending to if you are a Christian realist thinker or are interested in developing Christian realism for the 21st century? So, thank you.
Don't follow Debra, you'll have nothing else to say. But I'm going to say some things anyway. First of all, thank you, gentlemen, for the book. And I know you've got a third editor, Rebecca Miles, so thank you all. This is a very helpful contribution to the conversation. I'm going to start off with a quote. One thing I should say at the offset, like many things in life, and not just American life, there are various tribes, even within the larger tribes. And reading through some of this, it makes me realize that Christian realism really is no different. You can't really talk about Christian realism like with any kind of a definite article in front of it, because there's probably different kinds of Christian realisms. There's family resemblance, but like the siblings are a bit different, which is great. It makes it a richer tradition or theory. I want to begin with a quote from the very beginning by Robin Lovin. He says, "Christian realism is a reminder of our limits and an affirmation of our hope." And I like the quote, but it struck me when I first read it, and not just here, in his 2008 book, Christian Realism and the New Realities, it struck me as a little bit strange. Because and this is probably my sort of tribal trait, when I hear the word Christian realism, if I was doing one of those psych tests where I have to give you sort of a one-word response, you say Christian realist, I would say responsibility. That would just come sort of spilling out, all right? And if it's a thick book, and if the index is accurate, responsibility doesn't show up per se a lot. Now it's there throughout. The whole book is about responsibility, but as a term and as a point of reference, it appears, I think, in 4 essays, and most of all in Joshua's. One of the places it appears, and this is why I think it is such an important word, is one of the last, chapter 16, one of the last essays, Christian Realism in the African Context. The writer says this: Christian realism is a commitment to the imperative of moral responsibility in both the choices that are made and the actions or projects that are undertaken. And then here's the really meaty part. This shared commitment has its roots in what Paul Ramsey calls the Bene Is of the Christian tradition. That is, those primordial obligations that Christians believe that human beings were given at the dawn of creation, which include, but are not limited to, the duty to cultivate and keep the earth. All right, so where does Christian realism begin? I think the inaugurating statement is, let us make man in our image, and women, and let's give them dominion over all the earth, right? So this idea of dominion or providential care, which is why we named the magazine what we named it, right? This idea that we have stewardship responsibilities for creation. So duty, responsibility, dominion, providential care, all these words go all the way through Christian realism and animates it. So I think in a lot of ways, my amendment to Lovin's quote would be to say something like, Christian realism is a reminder of our limits and an affirmation of our responsibility. And I'm going to bracket hope for a second because it'll come back. But there's a part of me that thinks, well, that's not quite where hope is yet, okay? So I want to say a little bit more about why I think all this is so. All right, let us make man in our image, let him have dominion over all the earth. So now we exercise stewardship. And then, and I hope this isn't a spoiler, then there's this fall, right? Human beings fall away from our responsibilities. And so now the exercise of dominion in the context of the fall and a cursed earth, the earth isn't fallen, creation isn't fallen, creation is cursed, we're fallen. That seems important. But in the context of the human fall, dominion now has to be exercised, with the acknowledgement that human beings do not do what we ought to be doing, right? So it has to take into account the fact of the fall. This creates all kinds of tensions, and some of them have already been rattled off. Pride, sloth, right? Idealism, realism, stupidity, cynicism, love and justice, right? That's a paradox now, a tension. And this could also be cast, and often is the paradox between even the contradiction or the seeming contradiction between love and responsibility. All right, that's where I want to focus a little bit of my time. All right, Reinhold Niebuhr is, if we have a patron saint, Protestants can have patron saints. It turns out if we have a patron saint for Providence, it's Reinhold Niebuhr. And I sit uncomfortably on this idea, right? I love Reinhold Niebuhr. He's fantastic, but there are a few things he says that his tribe of Christian realism, I think, makes problematic for other tribes of Christian realism and sort of the larger world. One of them is this. This is going to be a grotesque simplification, but I'm going to just indulge myself. Reinhold Niebuhr, we just read an article yesterday by Reinhold Niebuhr in the Jean Beth Gaelstein Fellows Program that we run. And the essay is called Why the Christian Church is Not Pacifist. And in it, Niebuhr actually believes that the pacifists have it wrong, sort of the classic pacifists like Yoder, Hauerwas, Richard Hayes. Some of that's anachronistic. They weren't around when he was. But the pacifists have it wrong. The Christian ethic isn't nonviolence. The Christian ethic is non-resistance to evil, right? It goes all the way down. Coercion of any kind is out of line. The ethic of Christ is love, right? And this stands opposed to any kind of coercion whatsoever. So there's the law of love, and that is incumbent upon all Christians. But taking into account the fact of the fall, Reinhold Niebuhr also recognizes a competing law, the law of responsibility, right? And this is in tension. If you follow the law of love, if that's going to be your ethic, then the problem is you're not going to get the law of love accomplished. And if you're following it, you're also not going to get the law of responsibility. So it's like a lose-lose. But if you follow the law of responsibility and you season it or qualify it with as much love as you can, you'll get a little bit of a responsibility, an approximation of it at least, an approximation of justice, and you might get some love, right? So that's what you pursue. So Reinhold Niebuhr, I like to taunt my Niebuhrian friends, is a pacifist, which seems like a really strange thing to say to like the one man who almost single-handedly dragged the mainline church during World War I and the build-up to World War II into supporting the Allied cause. But Niebuhr is a pacifist. The difference between him and other pacifists is Niebuhr is a pacifist who is willing to kill. All right, and that's an essential distinction, and that's partly why I can travel a long distance with Reinhold Niebuhr. But here's the problem with Niebuhr for me. This reconciliation that I have to pursue the law of responsibility while not overruling love, bringing as much love in as I can. Nevertheless, by using things like force in order to bring about justice, I am dirtying my hands, all right? And dirt comes in different kinds. And for Reinhold Niebuhr, he will say something like, one cannot move responsibly through this world without incurring guilt. Right? And so he means to refer to the use of force as a moral evil, but it's a moral evil that we have to do, but it stains our souls, okay? Now, so Deborah asked the question, where's the location of tragedy? There's one place, right? Life is tragic. And so here we get, and I think Americans buy into this, right? Americans are a profoundly violent people. We're quick to it, and we're very good at it. But we've got an incredibly, I think, ambivalent attitude toward it. By ambivalent, I mean double-minded. You see this in American Westerns, right? The costs of exercising responsibility for the gunslinger who drives the evil out of the land in order to bring about the conditions necessary for justice, order, and peace. The exercise of responsibility comes with a cost, and it's a tragic one. It's usually you have no place in civilization, the civilization that you helped to bring into being and could maintain. Get out. And so they go off into the sunset, right, at the dying of the day. You see it in Jack Bauer, right? You see it in all sorts of places where the exercise of responsibility carries unbearable costs. We see it in our warfighters, right? So we've recently sort of concluded, 2+ decades in a global war on terror. And one of the things that came to the fore for those of us who were paying attention is this idea of some of the kinds of costs that those who do our nation's fighting endure for the rest of us. And so we've long known about post-traumatic stress disorder, right? And that's a life threat trauma that manifests in things like hypervigilance and paranoia. The global war on terror has brought to the fore a different kind of trauma that comes from the stressors of combat. And this has been coined a moral injury, right? And there's a couple different definitions for a moral injury. One is you suffer a moral injury when you endure an act of betrayal by a person in a position of authority in a high-stakes situation, right? That's one definition. The definition that I usually use is that a moral injury comes from doing or allowing to be done something that goes against a deeply held moral norm. All right. Sidebar, after the debacle of a withdrawal from Afghanistan, this idea of a betrayal by people in a position of authority in a high-stakes situation, I think, has come to the fore again. And I think our war fighters are suffering moral injury through a sense of being betrayed. We've told you folks for 20 years that this is worth the blood and the sacrifice. And then we pull out in a day and say, no, I'm sorry, we lied. Right? So that's come back to the fore. But this other definition of moral injury is very Niebuhrian, right? It's doing something that goes against a deeply held moral norm. And if coercion and the use of force and things like this in the Niebuhrian universe are moral evils, however necessary to avoid greater moral evils, then Niebuhr has made the very business of fighting a war, even a just war, by definition morally injurious, because you're doing those things that go against deeply held moral norms, even if you're preserving other, more deeply held moral norms. And the reason this is a crisis is that we've come to recognize that one of the primary causes of a moral injury is having killed in combat. One of the primary causes of combat veteran suicide is moral injury. So you could truncate all that and say one of the primary causes of combat veteran suicide is having killed in combat, right? And a lot of that comes, if you read soldier memoirs, you'll see this time and time again, from a misunderstanding of the moral nature of killing in a just war, right? Killing comes in different kinds. Some of it you should never do. Murder. End of the conversation. Eddie Gallagher, war criminal, right? Send him away. This kind of thing. No exceptions. Other kinds of killing in war are accidents, right? Maybe you should have been more careful, so there's varying degrees of culpability, but it's essentially morally neutral. But if just war tradition is correct, then there are certain kinds of killing that, according to the Hebraic tradition, are morally permitted, or even morally obligatory. And if that's the case, then it can't be right to say that doing those things incur moral guilt, right? Because that just doesn't make sense. So the just war tradition, I think, has a better way of describing the nature of responsibility in certain contexts than a purely sort of Niebuhrian one. There's much more to say on all that, and we can say it. In terms of, say it during the conversation, one of the reasons why I think this is important to mention in a review of a book on the future of Christian realism is now that the global war on terror is wound down and we're beginning to spin back up to face a peer-level fight that may or may not, hopefully not, be on the horizon. In the global war on terror, the responsibility for kinetic effects was limited to a relatively few military communities. A peer-level fight, that responsibility is going to be widely distributed across all military communities, some of which at present really haven't had to address the moral traumas of combat. And if my exposure to the military community is any indication, we're not quite ready for that yet, right? And so I think it's incumbent upon Christian realists, because we have the capacity, I think better than anyone, this is a partial answer to what does Christian realism contribute, we, better than anyone out there, have an answer to help our warfighters develop and maintain a kind of Kevlar for their souls, to be able to allow them to endure the morally bruising theater of combat without becoming morally injured. And that seems to me a great good. Debra asked about the tragedy. As you try to reconcile love and responsibility, which are not contradictions, but I grant there's a tension. As you work out those calculations about how to behave, there's always going to be a remainder in our cursed world dealing with fallen human beings. And that remainder, right, that stands outside the calculation, I think that's the seat of the tragic. And I think, therefore, that's the place that hope comes. Because as I try to reconcile love and responsibility, I'm going to realize there's only so much I can do. And there may be times where I ought to act. The just war tradition says this is a right fight it. And then prudence dictates, but you had better not, because you're going to be so disproportionate where you're not going to be able to do the thing. You're going to kill people and break things and achieve little good. Stand down. That's a tragedy. And I think the only way that we can make tragedy survivable is hope. Hope is a conglomeration of two things. It's expectation and desire, right? If you only have the expectation for something but no desire, that's not hope, that's dread, right? If you have the desire for something but no expectation that you'll get it, that's not hope, that's despair, right? But Christian realism, ground in the God of the Bible, is obviously the seat of hope. And I think that's what makes tragedy survivable. So, great contribution to the cause. Thank you very much.
Questions or comments, anybody?
I think our speaking team can sit up here.
Yes, please do.
If you don't have questions, we do.
Well, Dallas is the one who should answer that last one because he's the one who wants to talk about incurring guilt.
Not in this context. Yeah, I think, I mean, two things. Like, I hear a lot of both Elstein and Bigger in your distinction between different kinds of dirt.
I will often say Niebuhr is good, but bigger is better.
Nigel Bigger.
Yeah. I think that the idea of dirty hands depends on what you, how real you think tragedy is. Mm-hmm. So I don't think that the universe is tragic, morally tragic, precisely because I'm a Christian. So I think that the universe has the appearance of tragedy, but it can only be that God wills one thing. The divine will is not split. And so tragedy requires a conflict in the divine will, and I think that's impossible on theological grounds. So that doesn't make a difference in terms of maybe how you reason morally in a given situation, but it does make a difference in how you evaluate the sort of practices of repentance, repair, and there's the article that brings the language of dirty hands into the mainstream, both literature and public discourse, is Michael Walzer's article from 1972, Political Action, the Problem of Dirty Hands. And in that article, there's this really telling footnote where he grounds his account of dirty hands in the judgment of the patristic fathers that soldiers coming back from war, and by definition, this means a just war, were meant to not go to the Eucharist for a period of, I think it's 3 years. Not because they are deemed sinful on this account. Like the way the logic works, they are not sinful. The war's been justified, but exactly because the weight of the activity of war is, the gravity of it is so weighty. And so like that idea, I think, is what is undergirding a great deal of this tradition. So I'm not sure that there's a whole lot of daylight between the position that you're articulating and the one that Josh is sort of asking me to articulate, except for the fact that I want to say that that act really there's probably very little way around at least the feeling of guilt, even if the eschatological sort of view of it is to vindicate the act itself. And so I'm not sure that there's a language that is less than guilt that does the same work as it.
Grief.
Remorse is what Nigel talks about. Remorse.
Yes. Absolutely. That does all the work for me.
Huh?
That does nearly all the work for me.
Yeah.
And not all grief is guilt. Because I think, I mean, my reading of Niebuhr is it seems very clear in Niebuhr that he does think we take on moral guilt when we do these things, right? And I don't see that. And I agree with Walzer here, which is not a rarity, but it's somewhat surprising to agree with Walzer over Niebuhr. Yeah, I'll leave it there.
I think that what you use that experience for in terms of how you think morally, how you reason morally in the wake of it, like going forward. If you're using these as like this person in this instance should perform this activity, it's vindicated, it's just, then that seems to give, say, permission to do it in other sorts of ways that may extend it. And that's where I think that the position that remorse allows for, in Nigel's case, a revising of the rule itself, that to me seems too permissive. So it's doing too much work on the back end because it's too concerned about making the correct judgment of the act on the front end. That's actually not.
Yeah. So at play here are distinctions between being causally responsible for something versus morally responsible. I think also a distinction between moral and non-moral evil, which I think Niebuhr wouldn't take on board. Bonhoeffer didn't take it on board. Luther, I don't think, took it on board. Maybe it's a Lutheran problem. So there's lots to say.
Any questions from the audience who are here in the room?
Albert Thompson, you were one of the persons who suggested this panel.
No, it's my idea, yes.
Well, modestly reminded. Any response?
And can our audience members go to the microphone?
Sure, why not? Well, this has been thoroughly exciting. Is this mic on? Yes. Okay.
It doesn't sound like, but it's on.
I believe you, Mark. I am very glad that you have all come together to do this and that you're continuing to have this conversation. In fact, as an audience member, I'm more interested in hearing the four of you question one another on where we go now, given the political coalition that is emerging in the United States today, the realignment that has taken 8 years to occur, and how that creates parameters or limitations for how Christian realists can speak to the body politic today.
Can you just specify which realignment you have in mind, just so we're both talking about the same thing?
The one that was victorious last week.
Okay. Well, Deborah, you teed up the political questions. You had said that one party, I can't remember exactly what you were saying, one party tends toward...
Which one was worse? You said one was worse, and I didn't know which side.
I didn't know which one, and I have a feeling...
Which I thought was good that you were not predictable in that way, but I didn't know which one was worse.
Let me just answer your. So in terms of okay, I'm gonna have to think and talk at the same time, which is not necessarily my forte, but in terms of the political realignment, I'm actually not sure it is a realignment too much. And the reason I would say that is global rise in inflation after a global pandemic, incumbent parties are getting kicked out on the right and left all over the country, all over the world. So in that sense, a vote for the opposing party in the United States, where we only have two choices, isn't that surprising. Now, caveat, I do believe, as I indicated in my talk, that I think, the historical party of the left, the Democrats, not really very left, but center left, who was a party for workers, I think is no longer. That's pretty clear. And that might be what you were talking about when you said, specifically what you thought about in the realignment. And I do think that probably needs to be addressed. And maybe now the Republicans are going to be the party of the working class, and the Democrats will be the party of the college educated and above. And maybe that's going to be durable. I don't know because I think a large part of it was just the same swing as what we're seeing everywhere else. Now, in terms of, and so for that, there are a lot of folks who are, were not in favor of returning Trump to the White House due to his manifest personal deficiencies and demonstrated narcissistic personality. And I think, the problem isn't necessarily that he got reelected, because that maybe could have been predicted. But the problem for me as a Christian realist and somebody who thinks that generally morality does matter in politics and other things and that truth is necessary for democracy, is that you have one party that has just decided that they're going to go with that guy. And so the sort of collapse of the gatekeeping functions of the Republican Party, such that someone like Donald Trump could be the nominee 3 times in a row, I think that's a real problem, partially because the man has like a very passing relationship to the truth. And I don't know how you have a democracy when you have one side that argues in bad faith and plays whataboutism all the time, and also, again, has a very passing relationship to the truth. I just don't see how you can support that.
But if I may, just to chum the waters a
Yes,
bit,
go ahead.
what's even more astonishing than that, or also astonishing, is that the other side can't seem to furnish a candidate that appears to be a better choice than that guy. Right. So the problem, I don't think, is simply one-sided.
They did in the middle in the interim election, right? So
Oh, I don't know.
they did win.
I was in it. I hear
That's the
this
measure
critique, but
about
I
that.
don't hear that critique reversed often enough, right? Because a lot of people who voted for that guy
Yeah.
saw a similar choice and just decided at the end of the day, look, the small choices or small differences are going to matter. It's going to be this guy, right? Hold my nose and vote for him. That
is this guy?
Trump,
Okay.
right? Because I think the same critique. If you take out the party reference, a lot of people who voted for Trump will hear you and think, oh, she's talking about the Democrats.
Yeah, and then I think what you're pointing to, is just a sort of like general dissatisfaction and cynicism and even resignation, such that some people are willing to burn it all down. These are not conditions that are conducive to a healthy democracy or a functioning democracy. And so then, the question is, it does seem like, as you sort of was said, Christian realism is whether it's a political theory or a, political theology, it is, at least partially tied into a democratic system, right? It is a defense of democracy as a political system. And so what might Christian realism say to the exhausted majority, if you will, who maybe just like pull the lever for the other guy, whoever the other guy is, or lady, because sometimes it might be a woman.
And your point, I was also going to ask about your point about abortion. I was confused
Yeah.
about. Can you say more about what you meant by that? Because it kind of
Well,
went by.
I mean, if you're, so many Christians are abortion absolutists.
Okay, so that was your point.
Right.
Okay,
Yeah, that's the point.
they
They're,
can't-
right. It's
can't
always
be
wrong, and I cannot possibly compromise on this. There's no compromises available on this issue. No tragic necessity is available on this issue. Nothing. And therefore, anyone who tells me that they are, anti-abortion, or I will vote for them. Or if that person is, not in favor of an absolute ban on abortion, I won't vote for them. I can't, because as was recently, I read a piece in Mere Orthodoxy. The guy was like, well, a politician who is pro-choice, which let's say what that really means. What that really means is you just don't want to outlaw every single abortion in all cases or most cases, like the vast majority, 98% or whatever. That politician was actually willing evil to be done. And I'm just not sure those two things are equivalent, right? Because you might say that what's required to outlaw abortion in every case is actually worse. Because, in this sort of Kantian, right, to will the ends is to will the means. You have to will everything that goes along with it, which is like, women not receiving care for a miscarriage, because that's actually often basically the same procedure as an abortion, right? And then, like, are you going to start chasing down doctors? So far, you haven't seen women prosecuted and you haven't seen doctors prosecuted, but you might. Is that the regime you want? That's not really a liberal society. It's actually like a tiny bit totalitarian, right? Like a little bit of that coming in. And I also actually think we just have bad arguments. Like the abortion arguments, I've taught this. I used to teach ethics, and so you kind of can't avoid teaching abortion if you're teaching moral problems. And even the philosophical arguments are sort of dead-endy, right? It's zero sum. So you're either like women have absolute right to bodily autonomy or nearly absolute, or a human being, no matter how small, is still a human, and therefore an innocent life must be protected at all costs, right? The protection of innocent life above all. And I think there may be another way to look at it that might like crack open the door for a morally consistent position that would not lead someone who would say, I do not support abortion. I think abortions are not good, and they're, morally bad, and also would, so generally put them in the pro-life camp. I think there's a way you can sort of crack that open such that people might be less morally conflicted about living in a world or voting for a candidate who is pro-choice, which I could go into, but maybe not right at this moment because it's not like 100% developed. But I think there is a way forward that I haven't seen before, which is a little exciting if my argument is good enough. So, did that answer the question that you posed, Mark?
About abortion?
No.
That was Josh.
Oh, I'm sorry, Josh. I apologize.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Can I ask? This is going to change the subject. Okay. Self-interest takes a beating in the book.
Throughout?
No, probably not. I haven't read the whole thing, but maybe in both of your comments, but certainly one set of the comments. And I noticed it. It was probably maybe in your article, Joshua. Self-interest takes a little bit of a beating as a thing to be overcome. Is there, and this is a long-standing, debate. The problem of self-love, self-interest. Is there a kind of enlightened self-interest? Does self-interest play? Can we redeem self-interest per se as Christian realists? And is there a Christian realist contribution to helping us to think rightly about self-interest? Right? Like sometimes people will say, well, humility isn't thinking low of yourself, it's not thinking about yourself at all. I think, well, that can't be right. Maybe humility is like thinking properly of yourself. And then you can go on from there, something like that. Is there a kind of equivalent to self-interest?
We were talking earlier about Walter Russell Mead's recent article on Hamilton's revenge, I think it's called, in Foreign Affairs.
Yeah, I think so.
He makes an interesting point that I'll connect to that actually, because what he's talking about is how foreign policy in the U.S. basically from 1990, the post-Cold War on, right, for the next 15 years or so, was under the impression that the United States actually didn't have to think about its U.S. interest anymore, because the world interest and the U.S. interest were one and the same thing.
Yeah, right.
And so if you did whatever was good for the overall world, that just in and of itself was good for the U.S. And basically Mead's talking about how, it's clear now that that's actually not true, even at the corporate level and so on. And he's talking about all the need to kind of coordinate corporate interests at the national level alongside, the kind of national security interests. So I do think, I think it's important for Christian realism that self-interest is always there at different levels,
Right.
the individual, but also even the community, but also even the national level. You can't get rid of that either, and just think we're going to do what's good for the whole and not even worry about kind of our own people in any way. So I
It's
think
permissible for Christian realists to have special obligations or social.
I think it's
I think it's
necessary.
constitutive.
Yeah, I think it's necessary.
It's partially
It's not
constitutive.
even- it would be morally wrong not to. Yeah.
I think it may help just to say a bit about the background of the book. Josh and I originally conceived this as a project, sort of as a fellowship for Robin Lovin, and we talked about it in different iterations going back to 2013 or something like that. And to give the project some coherence, some conceptual coherence, we decided to use Robin's definition or description of Christian realism as including realism about political realism, moral realism, and theological realism. And Christian realism is always all three of those. And the political realism, at least, is constituted in part by a realistic assessment of self-interest. Right. And so it's an attempt to not allow the self-interest to justify the self morally. I think that's probably the sort of Christian realist response is something like, well, it's not the problem. The problem is not self-interest. The problem is when you justify your action based on self-interest. That becomes like the standard of moral justification is just that it is in my interest.
Simply in my interest.
Yeah, something like that. So I don't think that, not only do I think that there's a place for self-interest in it, I think it's actually, it's not realistic if you don't have it. Exactly because, I mean, this is the thing, like our interests are veiled to us in some way. We're not, we don't, right? We're,
Can I push that a little further? So you said it's not only unavoidable, it's unrealistic not to talk. Is it immoral not to have self-interest?
Immoral, you said?
Yeah.
to not have it or to not
Yes and yes. Sure.
Well, I mean, I don't know about like at the individual level. I have to think about that. But like even just where I would agree with Mead is I do think it would be immoral if you were a political leader in the U.S.
Right.
to not actually value the people of the U.S. higher than the rest of the world to some extent. I mean, not to the point of whatever enslaving people or something.
Not zero sum. Not
Yeah.
the nth degree.
But if it's all things being equal, if it's going to be better, you're in charge of this country. They should have a little bit more weight on the scale than the whole world. And that may be controversial for some, but I think if that's your steward, you're a steward of that organization or whatever.
as it is with a father or a mother
Yeah,
in a household.
your own
so that's
family.
with-
Yeah.
Right.
So I mean, yeah, to some extent, I do think even at the very individual level, you probably shouldn't just like let yourself go to down
duties to
go down the
yourself.
drain. Yeah, while you're
Yes, that would be the,
yeah,
the
exactly.
classic formulation. You have
Yeah.
duties to yourself. Yeah.
Yeah, good. It's helpful.
Yeah.
Well, I have a question.
Excellent.
So you're talking to an ordinary Christian in church who's never heard the term Christian realism. You have 90 seconds to explain it to them. Each of you give your definition of Christian realism, a definition that's accessible to regular people, starting with Marc LiVecche.
Starting with me. 90 seconds, go. I would just commend this fine book. No, Christian realism is both it's a compound noun, right? But it's also, and here's where I think it's maybe more important, Christian serves as, here's going to be my grammar test, an adjective, I believe, right? It qualifies realism. So it's a view that demands that we take a realistic view of the world when we try to adjudicate what it is we ought to do. And I say ought advisedly, it's not just should, right? Should might be prudentially prescriptive, but ought is morally prescriptive. So we have duties in the world, and the Christian realist says we should realistically identify what those duties are, but we also should take into account the conditions of the world and to recognize that duties have to be enacted in the conditions of the world. And sometimes there are limits as well as goads to how we do our duties, and the Christian realist tries to take all that into perspective. And then at that point, the person would walk away and be fine. But
I think I would say something like Christian realism is an American interpretation of the, particularly American interpretation of the broadly Augustinian tradition, in which humans have an infinite dignity that gives them capacities to talk, to love, to build relationships, but that humans are also deeply broken and fragmented and fragile and frail and finite. And the way I do this when I'm teaching systematic theology for my students, generally effed up. That's the technical use of the F words there. And that requires us to engage in both taking responsibility for repairing the conditions that make for our flourishing together, and that's politics. But also to being open to repair that we cannot achieve for ourselves, and that's grace. And so the project, I'm actually pretty deeply invested in the idea that it's theological and not just a political theory on this front. It's so that it's an interpretation of a kind of, I mean, definitely Protestant inflected account of Augustine that you see worked out in the best of human aspiration and human recognition of its limitations.
I would actually go with that. What was that first quote?
Robbins,
Which I think I put in there.
Christian realism is a reminder of our limits and an affirmation of our
Or hope.
Hope.
Because I actually think responsibility encompasses both of those. That's how I would do it. Responsibility has both, because you're responsible action involves attending to limits.
Right.
You can't ask someone to do something, jump to the moon or whatever. But also people living up to what they can actually, like all the way to the highest achievements that they can within those limits, and that's acting responsibly. And I think it would be a phrase that people could understand. Yeah.
And sure. So
Yeah.
another way to say that is a part of responsibility is understanding the limits of your responsibility. We are not I don't
The
know if
limits
this is
and-
Niebuhr
yeah.
or Bonhoeffer, but we are penultimately responsible for the condition of the world.
I would say, similarly to what has been said, that Christian realism is an approach to politics which holds that real good is achievable through politics, but that good is limited. And that is because human beings themselves, though they have capacity to for selfless love, they also have, they're fallen. And so all political settlements are partial and, limited and probably temporary. But there is also, because it falls, Christian realism falls within the Christian story, there is the possibility, it is God who will bring about final and complete justice. So that's the hope.
One quick version of this is actually just to recite the Serenity Prayer, which is Niebuhr's formulation of this whole thing to God, right? Grant me serenity, courage, and hope. This sort of like catches the vision in a form of a prayer.
We have, if you go online to providencemag.com, you will find an article called The Problem of Paradox. I wrote it about the Serenity Prayer, and it goes through the Serenity Prayer, or a version of it, to get to exactly these issues.
Yep.
Ann?
When did the war in Gaza become unjust?
When did it? Okay, so I think that's what's called begging the question, which means, has it become unjust? And I would have to answer at the threshold, I don't think it's become unjust yet. It is a justified war that is being fought more justly than any other army in history would be able to fight that war.
I'm saying as in, not using weapons.
Okay, maybe somebody else?
That never happened.
What was that last
When
thing?
did people start using weapons? That's what I mean.
Gotcha. Specifically with the Gaza war, or?
With the Gaza war.
Okay.
When did they start using
When
weapons?
did it become okay? Or is it okay?
Is it okay? Oh,
When did they start using
A long time ago.
in the Gaza?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think that this is a really complicated question because it assumes that there's a particular set of acts that constitute like a starting point, and a particular set of acts that could constitute an end point. And the set of relationships, the set of deeply disrepaired relationships that constitute life between the different groups there goes way, way back. And the current acts of both aggression and defense, I think, are based on particularly egregious aggressions and then particular decisions that people have made in response to it that are part of an ongoing conflict that has no easy solution.
Where you go? One thing I would add to that is a part of what Dallas is trying to struggle with is when does wrongs have been committed throughout history in the Middle East on both sides, right? And when does a particular set of wrongs justify a particular kind of response? Do you have a brother or a sister?
Yeah.
Right. So that makes your life complicated. It makes it rich and wonderful and ecstatic, but it also adds complications. I have a brother, I have a sister. There are times in our relationship where I might do something to him and, he yells and tells our mom. And then I say, well, the only reason I did it is, last week he did this. And that might not justify the response that I've given. But these grievances, these angers and hurts and harms are long remembered. And they blew up at a particular time in a particularly disgusting way in early October, which you probably know. And I think that action justified the behavior from the Israelis that we're seeing now. That doesn't mean, somewhere in the book, they point out that just war never means the purely righteous fighting against the purely unrighteous. It's always more complicated than that. But sometimes, despite all the complications, one side really does have to fight a war to win it in order to protect beautiful things.
As we conclude, I'm tempted to ask all four of you in unison to recite the Serenity Prayer, but that might be
There was more
unfair.
than one version, so we're
is
going
there?
to get it
Yes,
all
that's too
botched.
complicated. So
God,
thank you
give me the
for
serenity to accept the things I cannot change, because it starts with the limits.
Yeah,
The
The courage to change the things I can,
and the wisdom to know the
one
difference.
from the other.
One for the other. Yeah.
Yeah.
wow, you almost did it.
He changed the wording in the last phrase. Niebuhr did.
I use Nebers.
Yeah.
One from the other. Yeah.
Well, thank you for a very stimulating conversation. Debra Erickson, Josh Mauldin, Dallas Gingles, Marc LiVecche, we commend the book to you. This video will be posted on Providence YouTube, so I encourage you to share it with friends interested in Christian realism. Good night. Thanks for being here.
Thanks.